The afternoon sun streamed through the big windows of the music studio, painting warm squares of light on the polished wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the beams, slow and peaceful. The room usually smelled of old books and lemon polish, but today there was a hint of nervous excitement in the air. It was the day of the monthly recital. Parents sat on folding chairs in a small semicircle, their phones held up, ready to record. Their children, students of the studio, sat in a row by the wall, dressed in their best clothes. The girls had neat ribbons in their hair, and the boys wore stiff collars. They whispered to each other, their eyes bright with a mix of fear and pride. Dot at the front of the room. Near the beautiful grand piano stood their teacher. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and hair pulled back in a perfect bun. She wore a simple, elegant dress and stood very straight. To her students and their parents, she was the final word on music. She believed in rules, in practice, in doing things the right way. The right way was her way. She had spent years building the reputation of her studio, and she was proud of the proper, correct little musicians she sent out to perform at school events and competitions. And then there was the little girl sitting on a chair slightly away from the others, almost hidden in the corner where the sunlight didn't quite reach. She was small for her age, with quiet eyes that watched everything but gave little away. Her dress was faded from many washes, but it was clean. Her shoes were scuffed at the toes. While the other children had shiny folders full of sheet music, she clutched a single wrinkled page. The teacher's gaze often landed on this girl with a flicker of frustration. The girl's grandmother, a kind woman with tired hands, paid for the lessons in small, careful amounts. They couldn't afford a real piano at home, only a small electronic keyboard. The teacher had assigned the same simple scales in a beginner's melody for weeks, but the girl never played them correctly in class. During practice time, while the other students filled the room with clumsy but recognizable tunes, the girl would often just sit at her practice keyboard, her fingers resting lightly on the plastic keys. Not making a sound, the teacher saw this as a problem. She thought it was a lack of effort, or perhaps a lack of respect. She didn't see the fear or the love that was tangled up inside the child. She didn't know that in their small apartment, the girl would wait until her grandmother thought she was asleep. Then in the quiet dark, she would turn on the little keyboard, put the volume very low, and just play, not the assigned scales, but sounds. She would listen to the hum of the city outside and try to match it with a low note. She would remember a sad moment and let her fingers find a chord that felt the same way. She was speaking a language without words, all alone in the night. But in the bright, formal studio, that secret world had no place. The teacher had decided today would be a lesson, not just for the quiet girl, but for all the students. They needed to understand that talent without discipline was nothing. They needed to see what happened when you didn't follow the instructions. The recital began. One by one, the students walked up to the grand piano, their footsteps echoing. They gave little bows, sat on the bench, and played their pieces. They were careful and correct. A few notes were wrong here and there, but the parents smiled and applauded warmly. The teacher nodded after each performance, a small, tight smile on her lips. This was order. This was how things should be. Finally, the last signed-up student finished. The room relaxed. Parents started to gather their things softly, thinking it was over. The teacher cleared her throat. "Before we conclude," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the gentle rustle, "there is an important part of learning music we must remember. It is not just about applause. It is about the work we do when no one is watching. It is about dedication." She turned her head, and her eyes found the little girl in the corner. The girl seemed to shrink into her chair. "Our success is built on daily practice," the teacher continued, speaking to the room but looking straight at the child. on respecting the lessons. Let this be a reminder to everyone. She gestured to the piano. Come, play the C major scale and the simple song, The Happy Clown, for us. Let us hear where you are. A heavy, uncomfortable feeling settled over the room. The parents stopped moving. They understood what was happening. This was not a performance. It was a punishment. The other children looked down at their hands, embarrassed for their classmate. The little girl's face went pale, then flushed a deep, hot red. For a long second, she didn't move. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then, slowly, as if her feet were made of stone, she stood up. She walked the long walk to the grand piano, her worn shoes making almost no sound on the floor. The piano was huge and gleaming, a monster of polished wood. She looked tiny beside it. She climbed onto the bench, her legs dangling. She placed her wrinkled sheet music on the stand, the silly drawing of a clown smiling back at her dot. She took a shaky breath. The teacher stood to the side, arms crossed, waiting for the expected failure. The little girl lifted her hands. And then she began. The first sound that came from the piano was a weak, wrong note. It hung in the quiet air, a sad little plink. The little girl flinched, as if the note had hurt her finger. She tried again, forcing her small hands into the shape she had been taught for the C major scale. The notes came out, but they were stumbling and uneven. One finger missed its key entirely, hitting two at once with a clumsy, jarring sound. A few of the other children in the front row covered their mouths, not to laugh, but in a kind of shared, painful sympathy. They knew this feeling. They had all felt the terror of the wrong note in a quiet room. From her spot by the window, the teacher gave a small, almost invisible nod. This was going exactly as she had expected. It was a clear, clean lesson for everyone to see. Look what happens, her stern face seemed to say, when you do not put in the work. The parents in the folding chairs shifted. Some looked down at their hands, feeling awkward. Others glanced at the door, wishing they could leave and end this uncomfortable moment for the poor child. One mother reached out and gently put a hand on her own son's shoulder. The little girl's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears, a loud drum drowning out everything else. The sheet music in front of her, with its stupid happy clown, blurred into a mess of black lines and dots. They meant nothing. They were a code she couldn't crack. The room felt hot and too bright. All those eyes were like weights on her back, pushing her down into the hard piano bench. She stopped. Her hands fell into her lap, two small, tight fists. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, leaving a shiny track. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her wrist, ashamed. This was it. This was the humiliation the teacher wanted. She was the example of what not to be dot in that moment of complete silence. As she stared at the black and white keys, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but a kind of wall. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But underneath it, something else rose up. It was a feeling of loneliness. It was the memory of her small, quiet apartment at night. It was the sound of her grandmother humming softly while mending clothes. It was the steady rhythm of the rain on their window one lonely afternoon. All these feelings had a sound in her mind. They were songs without names. She wasn't thinking about the parents anymore, or the teacher, or the other children. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just didn't want the last sound in this room to be that weak, wrong note. She didn't want to walk back to her chair, carrying only that failure. She took a deep, shaky breath. It was a different breath from the scared one she took before. This one was deeper, filling her lungs. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she wasn't really looking at the piano in front of the class. In her mind, she was looking at her little keyboard in the dark. her hands came back to the keys. But this time, they didn't curl into the stiff scale shape. They relaxed. Her fingers, which had seemed so clumsy a moment before, hovered for a second, as if listening. Then she pressed down. The sound that came out was not a scale. It was a single, low note, held long and soft. It was like the hum of the city at night outside her window. It wasn't pretty, but it was true. It was real. From that one note, something unfolded. Her left hand found a few more deep notes, a simple pattern that sounded like a slow, sad heartbeat. Asterisk thump. Thump, thump. It was steady and grounding then. With her right hand, she began to paint. A few high notes trickled down, like the first few drops of rain hitting a tin roof. They were random, not a proper melody from a book. But they weren't random to her. They were the feeling of being alone in her room, watching the world go by outside. The music wasn't fast or showy. It was a conversation. The deep notes from the left hand asked a question, and the lighter notes from the right hand answered with a sigh. It built slowly. The sadness in the deep notes began to lift, just a little. The right hand's notes became brighter, clearer, like a patch of sunlight finding its way through a cloudy sky. They danced around each other, telling a story without words. A story of a long, quiet day. A story of a small hope. A story of finding a friend in the sounds you make yourself. The teacher, who had been standing with her arms crossed, slowly let her arms fall to her sides. Her sharp, prepared expression melted away, replaced by pure confusion, and then, slowly, by dawning shock. This was not noise. This was not chaos. She was a trained musician. She could hear the structure forming, like a plant growing wild but strong. She could hear the emotion, raw and true, flowing through those small hands. This was not from a book. This was from a heart. The parents forgot their phones. They weren't thinking about recording anymore. They were just listening. A father who had been looking at the clock now stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the small, serious figure on the bench. The mother who had comforted her son now had her hand over her own heart. The room, which had been full of awkwardness, was now completely, utterly still. The only movement was the slight sway of the little girl's shoulders as she leaned into the music, and the graceful dance of her fingers, which now seemed to know every secret of the piano keys. The lesson was over. But the real performance had just begun. The music that filled the room was not the kind anyone had come to hear. It didn't have a catchy tune you could whistle. It didn't follow the happy, sad, happy pattern of the songs in their lesson books. This was different. It was like watching someone think out loud, or seeing colors mix and flow on a canvas without a plan. The little girl was somewhere else. The bright room, the watching eyes, the teacher by the window, it had all faded away. In her mind, she was in a safe, dark place. It was just her and the sound. Her fingers, which had been stiff and unsure moments before, now moved with a strange kind of certainty. They didn't race across the keys to show off. They wandered. They explored. A low, rumbling chord here, like distant thunder. Then, a quick, sparkling run of high notes there, like a handful of raindrops hitting a puddle. She wasn't thinking about what note came next. She was feeling it. A memory of her grandmother's wrinkled hands, patiently sewing a button back on her coat, came to her. Her left hand answered with a series of warm, repeating notes that felt like a gentle, steady hug. Then, a thought of the lonely walk home from school, watching other kids with their parents. Her right hand traced a meandering, solitary line of melody that sounded a little bit lost, but also curious about where it was going. The parents sat completely still. One man, a father who worked in an office with numbers and reports all day, found his throat getting tight. The music wasn't telling him a story about clowns or dancing mice. It was making him feel things he didn't have words for. It reminded him of his own childhood, of quiet moments he had long forgotten. He blinked quickly, looking down at the floor. A younger mother in the back held her sleeping baby a little closer. The music seemed to wrap around the room like a blanket. It wasn't loud, but it was full. It had weight to it. She looked at the small girl, so fiercely focused, and saw not a shy student, but a little artist. She felt a pang of guilt for having been impatient earlier, for wanting the awkward moment to end. The other children were wide-eyed. They had spent months learning to play the right notes at the right time. They knew what was correct. This was not correct, but it was beautiful in a way their careful pieces were not. One boy, who always struggled to remember his notes, watched the girl's hands with awe. She wasn't remembering anything. She was just playing. The idea amazed him. He had never thought you could just do that. But the biggest change was in the teacher. She stood frozen by the window, the sunlight now feeling harsh on her skin. The stern expression she had worn like armor was gone. In its place was a look of utter shock, as if the ground had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Her trained ear, which had spent a lifetime judging precision and technique, was being confronted by something purer, raw feeling. She heard the mistakes. A chord was muddy here. The rhythm there was unconventional, not something you could count out in a strict beat. A proper judge would have marked points off. But the teacher, for the first time in maybe decades, wasn't listening as a judge. She was listening as a person, and what she heard shook her. This child, this quiet girl she had written off as lazy, was speaking. She was speaking a language deeper than words, a language of the heart. The music was sad, yes, but there was a thread of strength running through it. There was loneliness, but also a deep, searching hope. The teacher suddenly saw the cheap, silent keyboard at the girl's home. She saw the grandmother's tired, kind face. She saw the silent practice sessions in the studio, not as defiance, but as fear. And she saw, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that while she had been trying to teach this child scales, the child already understood the soul of music, something she, the teacher, had perhaps lost touch with in her pursuit of perfection. A cold wave of shame washed over her. Her plan to make an example of the girl now seemed cruel, small-minded, and utterly foolish. She had wanted to show the cost of neglecting the rules. Instead, the girl was showing the cost of neglecting the spirit. The teacher's hand, which had been resting on the windowsill, trembled slightly. She felt exposed, as if everyone in the room could now see the smallness of her intentions. The girl's piece began to climb. The wandering melodies from her right hand started to find their way, weaving together with the steady heartbeat from her left. The sadness didn't disappear, but it transformed. It became something bittersweet and strong. The notes grew a little louder, a little more confident, building towards something got, and then with a final, soft chord that sounded both like a question and an answer. It was over. Her hands lifted from the keys and settled back into her lap. The last note hung in the sunlit air, vibrating softly until it faded into absolute silence. The little girl kept her head down for a second, breathing slowly. She had come back to the room. The memory of why she was here, of the humiliation she was supposed to face, came flooding back. She braced herself for the disapproval, for the teacher's sharp voice telling her that was all wrong. But the sound that came was not a voice dot, it was the sound of a single person. The father who had looked at the floor, beginning to clap. It was not polite, gentle applause. It was a strong, solid clap that broke the silence like a crack of thunder. Then another parent joined, and another. Soon, the room was filled with it, a warm, roaring wave of applause that had nothing to do with being polite and everything to do with being moved. The little girl looked up, her eyes wide and unsure. She saw the parents smiling, some with tears on their faces. She saw the other children clapping, their faces filled with admiration, not pity. And finally, her eyes found the teacher by the window. The woman was not clapping. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was pale, and her eyes were glistening with unspilled tears. She wasn't looking at the audience. She was looking straight at the girl. And in her look, there was no anger, no disappointment. There was only a stunned, profound, and silent respect. The applause washed over her like a warm wave. It was so loud, so full, so different from the polite little claps that followed the other performances. For a few seconds, the little girl just sat there on the piano bench, her small hands curled in her lap, trying to understand the noise. Her heart, which had been hammering with fear, now beat with a strange, fluttering confusion. Were they clapping for her? But she hadn't played the right song. She hadn't played any song from a book at all. She looked out at the sea of faces. They were smiling. Not the tight, grown-up smiles she sometimes saw, but real ones. Eyes were crinkled at the corners. The mother in the back was nodding at her, as if to say, yes, that was it. The boy who was usually the best in class was staring, his mouth slightly open in awe. Then her gaze landed on the teacher. The look on the teacher's face made the applause around her fade into a muffled sound. The teacher was not smiling. She looked pale, almost shaky. Her eyes, usually so sharp and sure, were wide and soft, glistening with wetness. She looked right at the girl, and for the first time, the girl did not see a wall of strictness. She saw a person who looked surprised and sorry, and something else the girl didn't have a word for: humbled. The teacher took a small, hesitant step forward, then another. She walked slowly to the center of the room, near the piano. She raised her hands. The applause slowly died down, everyone curious, sensing that something important was about to happen. The room became quiet again, but this was a different quiet. It was an expectant quiet, not a waiting for failure quiet. The teacher cleared her throat. The sound was a little rough. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles white. "Thank you," she began, her voice quieter than usual. It didn't fill the room with authority. It was just a voice. "Thank you all for coming today." She paused, looking down at her own hands for a moment, as if searching for the right words there. When she looked up, she didn't look at the parents. She looked directly at the little girl on the bench. "And thank you," she said, her voice growing a little stronger, but also kinder. "Thank you for that, for what you just shared with us." The girl blinked. She had never heard the teacher use that tone before. It wasn't a teaching tone. It was a talking to a person tone. The teacher turned slightly to include the parents. "We spend so much time in these lessons," she said, focusing on the notes on the page, on the proper technique, on getting it right. She took a deep breath. "And those things are important. They are the tools." She turned back to the girl. "But what we just heard, that was a reminder of what the tools are for. That was not just playing notes. That was feeling. That was a story told in music. It was honest, and it was truly beautiful." A few parents nodded gently. The teacher's words were giving voice to what they had all felt. Then the teacher did something that shocked everyone in the room, most of all herself. She walked the last few steps to the piano bench. She didn't tower over the girl. Instead, she bent down slightly, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. Her expression was open, earnest. "I was wrong," she said, the words clear and simple in the silent room. "I asked you to play to show you hadn't practiced one thing, but you showed us something much bigger. You have a gift, a real gift. And I did not see it until now. For that, I am truly sorry." The girl's eyes went even wider. The world felt upside down. The teacher, the one who knew everything about music, was apologizing to her. The teacher stood up straight again, addressing the room but keeping a hand lightly on the edge of the piano near the girl. "Music is not just about the fingers," she said. "It is about the heart." Today, we were all reminded of that. This is what we should carry home. Not just the memory of a perfect scale, but the memory of a true musical heart. She gave a small, final nod. "The recital is over. Thank you again." This time, there was no more applause. Just a soft murmur of understanding, the sound of chairs softly scraping as people began to stand and gather their things. But they moved slowly, quietly, as if leaving a special place. Parents came up to their children, putting hands on shoulders, whispering. Their whispers were not about mistakes or wrong notes. They were things like, "Wasn't that something?" And that was really special. The other children flocked to their friends, their voices a hushed, excited buzz. They looked at the little girl not as the one who messed up, but as the one who had done something magical, something they didn't even know you could do. The girl finally slid off the piano bench. Her legs felt wobbly. She didn't know what to do. She started to walk back to her lonely chair in the corner to get her wrinkled sheet music. But before she could get there, she felt a gentle touch on her arm. It was the teacher. "Wait," the teacher said softly. She had the girl's single sheet of music in her hand. She looked at the drawing of the happy clown, then back at the girl. "May I keep this?" she asked. As a reminder, the girl, unable to speak, just nodded. The teacher smiled. It was a small, tired, but real smile. "Will you wait for just a moment after everyone leaves?" she asked. "I would like to speak with you, and your grandmother, when she comes." The girl nodded again. She watched as the teacher turned and began speaking quietly with the parents who were leaving. Her posture different, less rigid, more listening. The little girl stood alone by the grand piano, her fingers still tingling from the keys. The room was emptying, but the feeling in the air was not empty at all. It was full of a new, strange, and gentle warmth. The storm inside her was gone. In its place was a quiet, blooming surprise. The room slowly emptied. The murmur of goodbyes, the rustle of coats, the soft closing of the door. Soon, it was just the two of them in the big, sunlit studio. The little girl stood by the piano, tracing the smooth, cool wood with a single finger. The teacher was across the room, carefully putting away the folding chairs. The loud silence between them was not uncomfortable anymore. It was a space, a quiet place after something big had happened. Finally, the teacher finished. She wiped her hands on her dress, a simple, nervous gesture. She walked over, but instead of standing tall, she sat down on the edge of the low platform where the piano stood. She was now lower than the girl. It made her seem different, smaller, more like a person and less like a statue. "Would you like to sit?" the teacher asked, patting the space beside her. The girl hesitated, then climbed up and sat, leaving a careful space between them. Her legs dangled over the edge. For a little while, they just sat in the quiet. The teacher was looking at her own hands, folded in her lap. "What you played," she began softly. "Where did it come from?" The girl thought about it. It was a hard question. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely there. "It's just what it feels like inside. Sometimes." The teacher nodded slowly, as if this was a deep and important truth. "That is the most precious thing a musician can have," she said. "That feeling. I spend most of my time teaching people how to use their fingers. I had forgotten how to listen for the feeling." She looked at the girl. "I was trying to teach you a lesson today, but you ended up teaching me one. A much bigger one. I am sorry I put you on the spot like that. It was unkind. Can you understand that?" The girl looked at the teacher's face. She saw the tired lines around her eyes, the real regret in them. She didn't say yes or no. She just gave a small, slow nod. She understood the teacher meant it. Just then, the studio door opened with a soft creak. The girl's grandmother stood there, her old coat buttoned up to her chin. She looked worried, her eyes scanning the room quickly. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, her voice gentle. "The bus was slow. Did I miss the playing?" The teacher stood up quickly. "No," she said, and her voice was warm, welcoming. "Please, come in. You didn't miss the important part." The grandmother came in, her shoes making a soft sound on the floor. She came over and put a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, a familiar, comforting weight. She looked at the teacher, ready to hear about what had gone wrong, about the scales that weren't practiced. But the teacher did not talk about scales. "Your granddaughter," the teacher said, and her voice was full of a kind of awe, "has an extraordinary gift. Today, she shared it with all of us. She played something from her own heart. It was breathtaking." The grandmother looked down at the little girl and back at the teacher, confused. She had been prepared for a gentle scolding, maybe a suggestion that the lessons were a waste. She was not prepared for this. "I want to apologize," the teacher continued, her words clear and direct. "I misjudged her. I saw a student who was not following my path. I did not see the artist who has her own path. That was my failure." The grandmother's eyes grew soft. She squeezed her granddaughter's shoulder. "I would like to offer something," the teacher said. She took a deep breath. "I would like to offer her a scholarship. No more fees. I want to teach her properly. Not to change her, but to help her. To give her the tools, the notes, the techniques, so that the music inside her can come out even clearer in any way she chooses. She can learn the classical pieces, yes, but she can also learn how to write down her own songs.